believe last time we talked about the subject of character and how that is such a foundational idea to a person's spiritual formation. And here we are at the very first of the 5 marks that Wesley talked about. A Methodist loves God. Those words are so rich in and of themselves, but put them together, and that's a powerful statement. Loving God, do you have an experience of what it meant for you to discover that you were unconditionally loved?
I was fortunate growing up in the family I grew up in. We were a family of love. But the place where I knew that I was unconditionally loved by someone who wasn't sort of obligated to love me as a parent or even a school friend was Jeannie. You know Jeannie.
Right.
Your
wife?
My wife. Right. We met on a blind date, which means I had never seen her before. She didn't know anything about me, and she literally came around the corner of their house in a light blue dress. And I just had one of those cowabunga moments when I just thought to myself, you know, I've got to stick with this. And we've laughed about it over the years because I was ahead of her from almost that very moment. That morphed into a relationship now of nearly 45 years, more than 45 years actually, where I now know I will be able to die knowing what it was to be unconditionally loved by another human being. And maybe there are people who take that kind of experience and work backward into God. Maybe there are people who start with God and move the other way. At least in the character of a Methodist or the 5 marks, Wesley's starting not so much with the people around him as he is starting with God. God is love.
I see. Yeah.
And so that's got to have a landing place in your life. And you're a pastor, and I've dealt with students for more than 30 years. People come to us so deficient in having enough Velcro in their soul for love to even stick to it.
Right.
And so Wesley begins, I think, with this as the first mark because he wants to begin with God. Right. God is love. And so our response then is, we love God.
In fact, he says it as plainly as possible. What is the primary characteristic of a Methodist? It's someone who has the love of God shed abroad in their hearts.
That's right.
Again, each one of those words so rich and powerful. But of particular interest is that phrase, love of God, which can be interpreted one of 2 ways or both. Yeah. The love of God, do you think that's the love we should have for God, or is that the love that we receive from God? Or in what ways are those not mutually exclusive? One
of the neat things about that phrase is you can get to both sides of it by starting at either end.
Right, yeah.
So different people are going to come at it different ways. Like I tried to say with my story about Jeannie, some people might feel unconditionally loved by a human being and then come to learn that they're loved by God. Other people might start with the love of God and then discover how they're loved by other people. I really don't think God cares as long as we end up with both things. Yeah. Now, I think in terms of priority, we love because God first loved us. That's what John says in one of his letters. We're always responding. And the reason that may be important is in our day of self-help and all the rest, we can get the idea that it's up to us or that we get there first.
Right.
And that God's just hanging around to see what it is that we happen to want at a particular time. But really, we're always responding to a prior love. Yeah. So the love of God really is the priority. Even if we don't experience that way, it's still the reality of what's going on.
Yeah. What about?
But then I think the love of God is our response to that.
What about for a person that doesn't see God in a way that God is loving? Perhaps has a theology or a picture of God as being so austere, so distant from our own personal experience, transcendent. Not that there's anything wrong with transcendence in and of itself, but has trouble conceiving of a God who has that personal touch with us.
Well, then I'm going to go back to what I said a minute ago. That's where that person's probably going to have to be loved into God through the love of other people. Unless you happen to run onto a philosopher type who can mull over this stuff and go, oh, wow, I get it. The way most of us get it is having experienced it. And if you're having trouble experiencing the love of God, then most of us have to, your question a while ago, when did you know you're unconditionally loved? I started with Jeannie, not with Genesis.
Right.
Because that unconditional love had to have skin on it and love on it. And I had to be in the presence of another human being who loved me so much that she's been willing to put up with me all this time.
Right.
Well, now, gosh, if that's what Jeannie can do, what might God have been doing all the time, or what might God now be willing to do that I've never opened myself to? It's an amazing thing.
So Wesley said the love of God is to be shed abroad in our hearts. For Wesley, it seemed to be a matter of the heart for him. What do you think it means to have that love shed abroad? What does that mean in our hearts?
I think it means God loves first. And even if there's just a millisecond between God's love and our response,
Right.
it doesn't have to be years. You can just feel the love of God and respond to it. But you come to understand that that first mark, a Methodist loves God, is our first responder as a Christian to a prior act in our life. Merton's false self, other stuff like that. We don't really get into trouble until we think we're running the show.
That's right.
Just as long as we can understand we are the beloved before we either have the desire or the capacity to love, that'll serve us well more times than it won't. That will keep us pointed in the right direction, even if we don't always live it out.
So when you think about this first mark, the Methodist loves God, are there any other things that you think of that are important in terms of fully understanding Wesley's intent here?
I think Wesley wanted a responsive people. And what I mean by that is people who don't go to church on Sunday thinking they've already got it figured out. People who don't go to work on Monday thinking they've already got it figured out. If you go out into a thunderstorm and you carry this coffee cup, that's how much water you're going to get. But if you go out with a barrel, you'll get gallons and gallons. So the question is, when you go out into the world, how open are you to the rain, R-A-I-N-R-E-I-G-N? What kind of container are you carrying with you in life? If you carry a thimble, that's what you'll get. If you carry a barrel, that's what you'll get. If you stand under Niagara Falls in one of those yellow, made of the mist jackets, you'll be drying off for the next 3 days. Mark number 1 really is saying, how responsive are you to the God who loves you madly?
Which is a liberating word for anybody who feels like their heart capacity, their ability to love, is far too limited to love a God so as expansive and majestic as God. And the good news here is that God has given us the barrel.
That's right.
As opposed to our thimble.
Oh, that's right.
And so love in and of itself is a response, can only be a response to the flowing, abundant love that God has given to us.
I don't really want to have much to do with a God who's a trickle, but I'd like to have a lot to do with a God who can drench me. But I've got to be ready for that, or I'll only end up with a thimble's worth of Niagara Falls.
I love it. Thanks, Steve.